The recent shockwaves from the Trump administration's tariffs have sent far-reaching ripples through global markets. From the price of everyday goods to the production plans of major manufacturers, almost every sector has felt their impact. At the same time, these sweeping measures have raised enduring questions. Can a policy with such disruptive potential be sustained indefinitely? What ultimate effect will it have on the economy and trade? To explore these issues, it is instructive to examine episodes in U.S. history when presidents enacted equally bold and controversial economic measures. The experiences of past administrations shed light on the dynamics and potential consequences of such policies. Looking back to the late 1920s, the United States was emerging from World War I with a transformed economic landscape. Mechanization had driven a significant increase in production, and yet American farmers found themselves squeezed by intense global competition and persistently falling prices. By 1928, widespread financial distress had set in among those in the agricultural sector. Many farmers were burdened with mounting debts while commodity prices tumbled, creating an environment of uncertainty and hardship in rural communities. In response to these challenges, Herbert Hoover, a man who had served as Secretary of Commerce and who was soon to become the Republican presidential nominee, promised to safeguard American agriculture by raising tariffs on imported goods. He believed that higher duties would shield domestic producers from the low-price competition flooding the market. Upon winning the presidency in November 1928, Hoover moved rapidly. By June 1930, the United States Congress had passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, officially known as the Tariff Act of 1930. This landmark legislation raised the average duty on imports to around 52% and covered more than 20,000 distinct items. Although the primary focus was to provide relief for the agricultural sector, the act extended protectionist levies to a vast array of manufactured goods. At that time, many Americans ranging from beleaguered farmers to worried factory workers supported the measure. They trusted that higher tariffs would help secure domestic incomes and preserve jobs by insulating local industries from fierce international competition. However, the broader economic context was already dire. Less than a year after Hoover assumed office, the stock market collapsed in October 1929, marking the beginning of the Great Depression. Unemployment soared, banks failed in alarming numbers, and the overall sense of despair deepened. Instead of serving as a remedy, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act only compounded these problems. Foreign governments, feeling the sting of America's protectionist stance, retaliated with their own tariffs on U.S. exports. Between 1929 and 1933, global trade plummeted by roughly 65%, while U.S. stock prices suffered a catastrophic decline of nearly 90% from their peak levels. What had been intended as a safeguard for American livelihoods ended up accelerating the downward spiral of the global economy. One notable aspect of this policy was its endurance. Despite growing evidence that the tariff was exacerbating economic hardship, it remained in force for more than 3 years. At that time, the president did not possess the unilateral authority to impose such measures without congressional approval. Yet even with divided government and rising criticism from economists, lawmakers continued to support the policy. Farmers and industrial workers still reeling from the initial impacts of the Depression demanded ever higher barriers to protect their interests. The political momentum behind Smoot-Hawley persisted until Franklin D. Roosevelt assumed office in March 1933. Once in power, Roosevelt's administration began rolling back these protectionist measures as part of a broader strategy to revive trade and implement the New Deal reforms. In retrospect, many economists consider the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act one of the most consequential policy mistakes in U.S. history. It not only intensified the global economic downturn but also undermined confidence in the principles of free trade for many years afterward. Despite its long-term reputation, at the time the act was passed, few foresaw the full extent of its damage. Immediate political pressures and a narrow focus on short-term relief prevented a more cautious approach. Decades later, Another episode would present a similarly disruptive approach to economic management, this time focused on combating persistent inflation rather than protecting domestic producers through tariffs. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the United States found itself grappling with a steep rise in consumer prices. A combination of factors, including extensive spending on the Vietnam War, rising wages, and escalating energy costs, had driven inflation to levels that were unprecedented since the 1950s. By 1971, inflation had breached the 5% mark, creating mounting pressure on both households and businesses. In August 1971, President Richard Nixon delivered a televised address that captured national attention and stunned many economists and lawmakers. In that address, Nixon announced the end of the dollar's convertibility into gold, a monumental decision that effectively terminated the Bretton Woods system. Simultaneously, he announced a sweeping 90-day freeze on all wages and prices. Under this order, no increases in pay or prices were permitted for 3 months. The freeze covered a broad spectrum of economic activities, from factory production to the pricing of everyday grocery items. Nixon characterized this measure as a temporary emergency designed to stabilize an economy on the brink of disorder. To enforce his policy, he established 2 new bodies, the Price Commission and the Pay Board. These agencies were tasked with ensuring that businesses and labor unions did not attempt to circumvent the freeze by negotiating higher prices or wages without the necessary approvals. The initial impact of these measures was noticeable. Inflation, which had recently approached 5.8%, fell to around 3.3% by early 1972. For a time, consumers and workers long frustrated by relentless price hikes found relief, and even expressed strong support for the president's bold actions. Yet, while the freeze seemed to deliver short-term benefits, it also carried significant drawbacks. Artificially imposed price ceilings discouraged the production and distribution of essential goods. Many businesses found that they could not cover the rising costs of raw materials and inputs while being forbidden from raising prices, leading to cutbacks and layoffs. In some cases, the controls even led to shortages of critical products. Sectors such as agriculture and energy, which required flexibility to adjust to rapidly changing market conditions, suffered as they were unable to operate under the rigid constraints of the wage price freeze. After the initial 90-day period, Nixon opted to extend the controls in a phased manner. The program was divided into multiple phases. The first phase was strictly enforced for 90 days, but subsequent phases allowed gradual adjustments, albeit still within a framework of strict limitations. Phase 2 extended from November 1971 through June 1972, and Phase 3 began in June 1972 and lasted until April 30, 1973. By the time the administration lifted the broad controls, it was widely believed that the temporary emergency had abated. Unfortunately, the relief was short-lived. Almost immediately after the freeze ended, inflation surged once again. By mid-1973, consumer prices were rising at double-digit rates, undoing much of the perceived progress achieved under Nixon's policies. Then, in October 1973, the geopolitical landscape shifted dramatically. In response to political tensions, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries OPEC imposed its first oil embargo against the United States. Within months, oil prices soared, more than quadrupling in cost, which in turn drove up transportation and manufacturing expenses to unprecedented levels. Faced with these mounting pressures, Nixon responded by imposing targeted controls on the price of oil and gasoline in November 1973. His hope was that such measures might forestall another surge in inflation. However, the accumulated pressures proved too great for the controls to hold. By early 1974, even these limited measures collapsed and inflation surged past 11%. The economic turbulence during these years was mirrored by significant volatility in the financial markets. During Nixon's tenure, the U.S. stock market experienced 2 distinct bear markets. Between January 1973 and December 1974, the S&P 500 lost nearly half of its value. Investors and consumers came to regard the wage price controls as a temporary band-aid that ultimately failed to address the underlying economic imbalances. Although Nixon's measures remained in place for nearly 3 years, the growing unintended consequences eventually eroded the political will to continue such restrictive policies. By 1974, as criticism mounted and pressure from Congress and business groups intensified, the controls were finally abandoned, leaving behind a legacy that included shortages, the emergence of black markets, and a deep-seated erosion of public trust in government interventions. These two historical episodes, the protective tariffs of the Hoover era and the wage price controls under Nixon, reveal several common threads that help illuminate the dynamics of disruptive economic policies in the United States. In both cases, these policies emerged in response to acute economic crises. Hoover's tariff policy was conceived amid a struggling farm economy on the brink of the Great Depression, while Nixon's measures were introduced as a desperate attempt to rein in runaway inflation and stabilize a crumbling international monetary system. In each instance, the urgency of the moment provided political cover for sweeping, unconventional measures. A striking similarity between the two policies was the broad, initial public support they enjoyed. In the early stages of implementation, both the tariff measures and the wage price freeze were backed by key constituencies. American farmers, factory workers, and ordinary consumers saw these policies as tangible solutions to their immediate problems. Their support was instrumental in overcoming various legislative and administrative obstacles. However, as time wore on, the deeper economic damage became increasingly apparent. Tariffs remained in place long enough for significant retaliatory measures by other nations to take effect, and the wage price controls eventually led to shortages and inefficiencies that undermined their short-term benefits. By the time critics raised concerns about the long-term viability of these policies, political inertia and entrenched interests had made it difficult to reverse course without significant political cost. Another common element was the eventual reversal of these disruptive policies. History shows that neither Hoover's tariffs nor Nixon's controls could be maintained indefinitely. In both instances, once the negative effects became too overt, be it through a dramatic downturn in international trade or through crippling economic dislocations at home, a new administration stepped in to restore balance. Franklin D. Roosevelt's rollback of protectionist measures helped reestablish the framework for a new era of trade liberalization in the 1930s. Similarly, in the years following Nixon's presidency, the eventual abandonment of wage and price controls paved the way for a gradual market-oriented recovery. Public opinion played a critical role as the arbiter of these policy experiments. In the early stages of both cases, the promise of immediate relief secured widespread backing. However, as adverse impacts emerged, voters and key constituencies turned against the measures. Farmers who had once lauded the tariffs began to realize that protected markets were shrinking because of retaliatory tariffs imposed by other nations. Similarly, consumers who initially welcomed the price freeze found themselves facing empty shelves and long lines at grocery stores. This shift in sentiment ultimately compelled politicians to abandon or modify the policies that had once enjoyed near-universal support. Fast-forwarding to the present, the Trump administration's tariffs have reignited debates over the balance between protectionism and the costs of economic isolation. In April 2025, President Trump announced an expansive set of reciprocal tariffs. The policy imposed a baseline duty of 10% on nearly all imports, while selectively assigning rates as high as 25% to key trading partners and strategic sectors. At the same time, existing levies on critical materials such as steel, aluminum, and auto parts remained in place. Exemptions were provided for goods that met the criteria of trade agreements with Canada and Mexico under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. These steps were taken to reinforce domestic industries and protect jobs, even as critics warned that such measures could spark a broader trade conflict. Almost immediately after the announcement, the markets reacted with noticeable volatility. The S&P 500 experienced a significant drop, global currency markets fluctuated erratically, and commodity prices showed signs of instability. Major business leaders expressed concerns about potential disruptions in supply chains, while consumers braced for higher costs on a wide range of products, from everyday electronics to essential groceries. Despite the initial shocks, the administration soon spotlighted a series of positive developments. For instance, Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing company announced an additional investment of $100 billion to expand its manufacturing facilities in Arizona. This move was cited as evidence that, even in the face of heightened tariffs, foreign companies viewed the U.S. as an attractive destination for long-term investments. At the same time, Honda declared plans to shift the production of its next-generation Civic Hybrid from Mexico to Indiana, beginning in 2028. This strategic decision was aimed at avoiding potential duties on imports and underscored how companies were recalibrating their supply chains in response to evolving trade policies. Public opinion, as it turned out, was mixed but resilient. Recent polls indicated that approximately 41% of Americans were optimistic that the administration's economic policies would yield long-term benefits, while roughly 44% expressed overall approval of the president's performance. These figures are in line with other surveys that placed his economic approval rating in the mid-40s. In many ways, the current situation echoes the historical patterns observed under both Hoover and Nixon. Early signs of positive developments such as new investments and strategic business adjustments can help sustain controversial policies even as they generate significant market disruptions. It appears that, at least in the early phase of implementation, the administration's approach is buoyed by a mixture of cautious optimism among key groups and a willingness on the part of policymakers to absorb short-term pain for anticipated long-term gains. Yet the enduring question remains: how long can such a disruptive policy persist before the negative consequences become overwhelming? History suggests that the window of opportunity for bold, far-reaching economic measures tends to narrow as soon as the honeymoon phase of a new administration ends. Typically, the initial 3 to 6 months are marked by a relative calm, during which media attention and political opposition are limited. However, as the months progress toward midterm elections, the cumulative effects of such policies begin to surface. Political resistance increases as consumers, workers, and legislators start to feel the pinch of rising prices, disrupted supply chains, and other unintended consequences. This trend was evident both during the era of Hoover's tariffs and under Nixon's wage price controls. As public sentiment shifts and the political cost of maintaining such policies rises, pressure mounts for a course correction or outright reversal. If Trump's tariffs are primarily intended as a negotiating tactic, a means to gain leverage in trade discussions, it is conceivable that a series of tit-for-tat measures could be expected. In such a scenario, initial aggressive tariffs might eventually be followed by negotiations and partial rollbacks as trade partners adjust their own policies in response. On the other hand, if the goal is to institute a long-term shift toward higher trade barriers, the administration will be forced to navigate an increasingly complex and hostile political landscape. Persistent upward pressure on consumer prices, ongoing disruptions to supply chains, and the risk of retaliatory measures by other nations all contribute to an uncertain future for this policy approach. For investors and market observers, a key indicator of the policy's longevity will be the evolution of public sentiment. When a critical mass of consumers, labor groups, and legislators begins to register the economic pain, political support for continued aggressive tariffs is likely to wane. Whether this shift will occur before the 2026 midterm elections or extend further into 2027 depends largely on how severe and widespread the adverse effects prove to be. In the end, history teaches us that while bold and disruptive economic policies might initially secure broad public backing by offering promising short-term relief, they often prove unsustainable in the face of persistent market pressures. Over the decades, the U.S. has repeatedly witnessed episodes in which policy initiatives, although designed to confront immediate economic challenges, evolve into long-term experiments with unpredictable outcomes. The experience of Hoover's tariffs serves as a cautionary tale. What began as a measure to protect American farmers eventually contributed to a cascade of retaliatory actions by trading partners, ultimately deepening the economic crisis. Similarly, Nixon's wage price controls, though initially successful in taming inflation, eventually led to production inefficiencies, shortages, and an erosion of consumer confidence. These episodes underscore the inherent risk of relying on sweeping, interventionist policies as a means of addressing complex economic challenges. Moreover, these historical precedents highlight the delicate balance that policymakers must strike between immediate crisis management and the long-term health of the economy. The political pressures that propel a president to take radical action are often intense in times of distress, yet the very measures that provide short-term relief can, over time, become the seeds of deeper systemic problems. In both the Hoover and Nixon cases, the underlying economic vulnerabilities were not resolved by the interventions. Instead, the policies served to delay inevitable adjustments, at the cost of inciting countermeasures from domestic constituencies and international partners alike. In today's context, as the Trump administration's tariffs continue to influence market dynamics, the interplay between short-term gains and long-term costs remains as relevant as ever. The administration has managed to secure a degree of political cover by emphasizing the benefits of encouraging domestic investment and by highlighting the strategic realignments taking place among major corporations. When Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing company announced its expansive investment in Arizona and Honda indicated plans to reconfigure its production footprint, those announcements were presented not simply as isolated business decisions, but as integral parts of a broader policy framework intended to boost the nation's economic competitiveness. Such developments, in the early stages, offer a counter-narrative to the more pessimistic forecasts of a cascading trade war. Nevertheless, as history suggests, the durability of these measures will ultimately depend on how effectively the broader economic system can absorb and adapt to the disruptions they cause. While initial investments and strategic pivots provide some evidence of resilience, sustained economic growth requires a stable and predictable environment in which trade, consumer confidence, and innovation can flourish. If the adverse impacts of high tariffs begin to manifest more forcefully through rising consumer prices, significant supply chain disruptions, or a precipitous decline in international trade, the political calculus is likely to shift. In such a scenario, both opposition within Congress and rising discontent among affected constituencies could force a reevaluation of the policy direction. It is also worth noting that the dynamics of public opinion are central to the fate of any disruptive economic policy. In both historical episodes reviewed here, the initial support of key groups eventually gave way to growing opposition as the economic consequences began to outweigh the immediate benefits. American farmers who had once welcomed protective tariffs found themselves facing the reality of diminished export markets. Workers who had initially backed wage price controls soon encountered the harsh consequences of product shortages and inflated prices. This evolution in public sentiment serves as a natural check on governmental interventions that, while designed to address urgent problems, also carry the risk of long-term economic dislocation. As the nation navigates the current trade landscape, the experience of past eras offers important insights. The Trump administration's tariffs, like earlier protective measures and price controls, are embedded within a historical continuum that demonstrates both the potential efficacy and the eventual limitations of such interventions. While the early stages of policy implementation may generate optimism through measures such as increased domestic investment and the recalibration of international supply chains, the long-term consequences remain uncertain. History reminds us that economic policies are not static, they evolve in response to changing conditions and shifting public sentiments. For policymakers, business leaders, and consumers alike, the unfolding narrative serves as a reminder of the inherent uncertainties of managing a complex and interconnected economy. Strategic decisions taken in moments of crisis carry with them the potential for unintended consequences, even as they offer the promise of immediate relief. Whether the current approach of deploying tariffs as a negotiating tool or as part of a broader strategy to reshape trade relationships will yield lasting benefits remains an open question, one that will likely be answered in stages, as the cumulative impacts of the policy become evident over time. Moreover, the experience of past administrations underscores the importance of maintaining a flexible policy framework. Historical lessons indicate that rigid adherence to interventions, even those that begin with broad public support, can ultimately lead to economic distortion if sustained for too long. The ability to adapt and recalibrate in response to evolving conditions is essential. In the context of today's tariffs, the sustained willingness of policymakers to listen to shifting public opinion and to adjust strategies in response to market feedback will be crucial in determining whether the measures can be maintained without causing undue harm. Observing these developments from a broader perspective, one is reminded of the adage that the success of any government intervention depends not only on its immediate objectives, but also on its long-term impact on the stability and vitality of the economic system. In both the tariff policies of the Hoover era and the wage price controls of the Nixon years, the initial optimism eventually gave way to a recognition of deeper systemic vulnerabilities. In that sense, the current tariff policy may well be viewed through a similar lens. While early indicators such as targeted investments and strategic corporate responses provide a measure of confidence, the underlying reality remains that any policy designed to fundamentally alter economic relationships carries inherent risks that must eventually be confronted. For investors, market analysts, and political observers, the unfolding situation offers a rich source of lessons. It is not merely a matter of whether tariffs can protect domestic industries in the short term. It is also about understanding how such policies interact with global economic forces and how they are ultimately tempered by public opinion. The pattern that emerges is one in which initial enthusiasm gives way to a more measured and cautious reassessment as the broader implications become undeniable. In this light, the evolution of the Trump administration's tariffs is likely to follow a trajectory similar to those seen in past episodes: a phase of bold experimentation, followed by the gradual emergence of countervailing pressures that ultimately demand policy adjustments. In summary, the story of disruptive economic policies in the United States is one of cyclical experimentation and cautious retrenchment. From Hoover's aggressive protective tariffs to Nixon's ambitious wage price controls, each period of rapid intervention was characterized by a confluence of political urgency, initial popular support, and eventual backlash as unintended consequences emerged. Today's trade policies, with their mix of broad-based tariffs and selective exemptions, echo these earlier experiences. The interplay between short-term benefits and long-term costs will continue to shape the policy landscape, guided in no small part by the evolving judgments of the American public. As historical patterns remind us, early support can mask profound disruptions that only become clear with time. Investment announcements and optimistic business strategies may provide temporary reassurance, but sustained economic prosperity requires a careful balance between protection and competition, between intervention and market-driven dynamics. The current administration, buoyed by favorable early indicators and tempered by robust public opinion polls, has carved a path that appears to be both bold and, at least initially, effective. However, the enduring lesson remains that policies with far-reaching consequences rarely escape the corrective forces of market realities and shifting public sentiment. In reviewing the experiences of past administrations, it is evident that the dynamics of economic policymaking are as complex as they are cyclic. The measures pursued under crisis conditions, whether protective tariffs or stringent wage and price controls, reflect the urgent need to address immediate challenges. Yet, the long-term health of the economy hinges on the ability to adapt and recalibrate policies as conditions evolve. The present trade policy, driven by both strategic concerns and a response to domestic pressures, is no different. Its future will depend on the careful calibration of benefits against costs, on the resilience of American industries in a global market, and ultimately, on the capacity of the political system to respond to the clarion call of public sentiment. The unfolding chapter in U.S. economic policy is a continuation of a long tradition of bold interventions aimed at protecting national interests. As new investments are announced, as supply chains are reconfigured, and as consumer prices react to shifting trade policies, all eyes remain fixed on the balance between immediate relief and long-term stability. In this context, the interplay of political will, market responses, and historical lessons will serve as the guiding forces in determining the ultimate outcome of these policies. Taking all these elements into account, the current approach to tariffs must be seen not as an isolated experiment but as part of a broader historical continuum. Previous episodes have shown that while aggressive policies may find early success by meeting immediate public demands and reinforcing domestic industries, they are also susceptible to a delayed but inevitable reckoning as broader economic pressures come into play. This dynamic holds true whether the intervention is designed to stabilize a faltering economy, as in the 1930s, or to tame the rapid rise of inflation in the early 1970s. Ultimately, the future of any disruptive economic policy will be determined by the extent to which it can be sustained amidst evolving conditions. Robust public debate, coupled with the inevitable corrective actions of international partners and domestic institutions, will shape the trajectory of such measures. A clear-eyed assessment of both historical precedents and current market responses is essential for understanding not only the short-term impacts of these policies, but also their long-lasting implications for national and global economic stability. The present narrative, therefore, encapsulates the tension between bold intervention and incremental adjustment attention that has defined U.S. economic policymaking for nearly a century. As the nation moves forward, the lessons of the past provide a framework for understanding the risks and rewards of policies that disrupt conventional economic relationships. While initial successes may lend confidence to sweeping measures, the historical record cautions that the corrective forces of market dynamics and public opinion are not easily overcome. In closing, the evolution of disruptive economic policies in the United States demonstrates that immediate political gains and short-term economic relief are often accompanied by long-term challenges. The historical experiences of Hoover's tariffs and Nixon's wage price controls illustrate that even well-intentioned measures, when maintained over time, can lead to unintended consequences that undermine their original objectives. In today's context, the Trump administration's tariffs have shown both the potential to stimulate domestic investment and the risk of broader market disruptions. As these policies continue to evolve, their ultimate success or failure will depend on how well they balance short-term intervention with long-term economic sustainability. Overall, the narrative of U.S. economic policy reveals a complex interplay of political necessity, public opinion, and market forces. While disruptive policies may initially appear to offer clear benefits, history teaches us that their long-term viability is contingent upon their ability to adapt to rapidly changing conditions. In the end, only time will tell if current measures will deliver lasting economic stability or ultimately give way to the corrective adjustments that have characterized previous eras of U.S. economic intervention. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel.